The moment I saw her phone glued to her hand, something inside me snapped. I didn't say anything right then. I'm not the kind of man who jumps to conclusions, but I've seen enough in life to know when something's not right. Laura, my wife of 5 years, had been slipping away from me for months. I just didn't want to admit it. You know how it is when you try to hold on to a sinking ship. You convince yourself that if you work harder, show more patience, everything will fix itself. That's the game I was playing until that Friday morning when she dropped her little bombshell over breakfast. "Jack, I'll be out of town this weekend," she said, not even looking up as she poured her coffee. "It's for work, some development seminar near the riverfront. Don't bother calling. I'll be busy." I put my cup down a little harder than I meant to. "Don't bother calling? You mean to tell me you can't spare 2 minutes for your husband?" Her eyes finally met mine, but they were cold, detached. "It's not like that, Jack. It's important. I don't need you checking up on me." That's when I realized something was really wrong. Laura had always been headstrong, one of the things I admired about her, but this wasn't stubbornness. This was dismissal, pure and simple. And it hit me like a punch to the gut. "Fine," I said, keeping my voice steady, though my blood was boiling. "Go do what you have to do." She didn't even bother to kiss me goodbye. "My name is Jack Marino, and I'm not a man who's easy to fool. I grew up in Pittsburgh, in a neighborhood where you learned early on to spot a liar. My best friend, Dominic Russo, and I were two kids running the streets, thinking we were invincible. That kind of life teaches you lessons you don't forget. Loyalty matters. Trust matters. And when someone breaks that trust, you don't just sit back and take it. Laura was different, or so I thought. When we met, she was this confident, magnetic woman who made me believe I could leave my past behind. We got married a year later, and for a while, it felt like I'd hit the jackpot. But somewhere along the line, things started to crack. It wasn't obvious at first. She'd always been ambitious, throwing herself into her job like it was her life's mission. I admired that about her. But after she lost her job 3 years into our marriage, everything changed. She shut me out, started snapping at me for no reason. I tried to be patient, to help her through it, but it felt like she was building walls I couldn't break down. Then she got the new job at a real estate agency. And for a while, it seemed like things were getting better. She was smiling again, talking about promotions and big opportunities. But it wasn't long before the distance returned, bigger and colder than ever. The phone was the first clue. Laura had never cared much about her phone before. She'd leave it on the counter, unlocked, without a second thought. But now, it was always with her, clutched in her hand or tucked in her purse, and she'd go stiff any time I got near it. I confronted her once, not long before she announced her little work trip. "What's with the phone, Laura? You've been glued to it lately." Her head barely turned as she scrolled through whatever nonsense was on her screen. "Just work emails." "Work emails? At 10 o'clock at night?" I leaned forward, my voice hardening. "You never used to hide things from me." She sighed like I was a kid throwing a tantrum. "Jack, it's not a big deal. Stop making it one." I wanted to grab the damn phone and see for myself, but I didn't. Not then. When she left for her seminar, I didn't sit around twiddling my thumbs. I wasn't going to be some clueless husband waiting at home while his wife got cozy with God knows who. I called Dominic. It had been over a year since we'd last talked, but Dom was the kind of guy who'd drop everything if you needed him. He answered on the second ring. "Jack, it's been a while, man. What's up?" "Laura's up to something," I said, cutting to the chase. "I don't know what, but I need to find out." Dom didn't even hesitate. "Say no more. Meet me at Tony's bar tonight, and we'll figure it out." That's the thing about Dominic. He doesn't waste time on questions when someone he cares about is in trouble. By the time I sat down across from him that night, I had a pit in my stomach the size of a boulder. I laid it all out for him. The phone, the distance, the excuses, and now this sudden trip. He listened quietly, nursing his drink, and when I was done, he leaned back and let out a low whistle. "You know what they say, Jack? If it walks like a duck and quacks like a duck." "I know," I said, my jaw tightening. "I just need proof." Dominic grinned, but it wasn't a friendly grin. It was the kind of grin that sent a shiver down your spine if you didn't know him. "Don't worry, buddy. Proof is my specialty. Let me know when you're ready for the next part." When Laura returned from her so-called seminar, I was already waiting at home, sitting in my armchair with a whiskey in hand. She walked in the door like nothing had happened, carrying her suitcase and humming some tune. "Did you have a good weekend?" I asked, my voice calm but sharp enough to cut glass. She paused, just for a fraction of a second, before answering. "It was fine. Long meetings, but productive." Her lie was so smooth, so casual, that it almost sounded believable. But I knew better. Over the next week, I started paying attention to every little detail. When she went to bed early with her phone in hand, when she claimed she had to work late at the office, even when she laughed at something she'd read on her phone and quickly put it down when I walked into the room, I noticed it all. I didn't say anything, not yet. My gut told me to wait, to gather evidence. And that's when Dominic came through. "Jack," he said on the phone one night, "I've got something for you. It's not pretty, though. You ready for this? Just tell me." She's been meeting a guy, Ethan Harper, works with her at the agency. My knuckles went white as I gripped the phone. "How do you know?" "I followed her," Dominic said, his tone matter of fact. "They had dinner at a little restaurant downtown Friday night, then went to a motel. I've got pictures." Pictures. The word hit me like a brick. It was one thing to suspect. It was another thing to see it confirmed. "Send them to me," I said through clenched teeth. When the pictures arrived in my inbox later that night, I stared at them for what felt like hours. There she was, my wife, sitting across from some smug-looking guy at a candlelit table. The next photo was of them walking into a motel together. The timestamp was from Friday night, when she was supposedly at that seminar. I should have been angry, but what I felt was worse. Cold, calculated rage. The next few days were a blur of surveillance and strategy. Dominic helped me dig deeper. We tracked her movements, combed through her social media, even found out that Ethan had been bragging about their arrangement to a couple of his buddies. Then came the email. It hit my inbox late one night, titled, "Who's the last one to know?" I hesitated before opening it, my stomach churning. The first photo showed Laura and Ethan at a motel room, their bodies pressed together in a kiss that made my blood boil. Beneath the photo was a caption. "Want to know what happened after this? Click the link." I clicked it, and what I saw made me physically sick. Another photo, this one of Laura and Ethan completely naked, standing close together with grins on their faces. Below it, another caption. "Still curious? Keep going." The next image burned itself into my brain. A shot of Laura on all fours on a bed. Ethan behind her, her face twisted in an expression I hadn't seen in years. I closed the laptop and sat there, shaking. Not from sadness, but from fury. By the time I poured myself another drink, the cold, calculating side of me had taken over. This wasn't going to end with a confrontation. This wasn't going to end with me crying in some corner, wondering what went wrong. No, this was going to end with Laura and Ethan paying for their betrayal. "Dominic," I said when I called him the next morning, "I'm ready to move forward." The morning after receiving the email, I didn't bother going to work. I sat in my office at home, staring out the window, with Dominic's words echoing in my head. "She's been meeting a guy." The pictures were bad enough, but the email felt like someone wanted to drive the knife deeper. Whoever sent it wasn't just informing me. They were making a statement. By noon, Dominic was at my house, and we were going over everything. He spread the printed photos across my desk like he was laying out evidence in a courtroom. "I did some digging," he said, tapping one of the photos where Laura sat at a bar with a smug-looking man. "Ethan Harper, single, mid-30s, works in marketing at her agency. No criminal record, but he's got a reputation. Real smooth talker. Thinks he's God's gift to women." I clenched my jaw as my hand tightened on the edge of the desk. "How long has this been going on?" Dominic shrugged. "Hard to say. Maybe a few months. Maybe longer. I've got his address, phone records, and even the spots they like to meet. He's been careful, but not careful enough. Careful enough to make her feel safe." I muttered bitterly. That was what burned me the most, the audacity. Laura wasn't stupid. If she was taking risks, it was because she thought I'd never catch on. That smug confidence stung more than the betrayal itself. "What about the email?" I asked, leaning back, my mind racing. "That's the interesting part," Dominic said, sliding a piece of paper toward me. "The IP address traces back to her office. Looks like someone there doesn't appreciate the little lovebirds playing house." "Good," I said, tapping my fingers against the desk. "What else?" Dominic hesitated for a moment. There's one more thing. They've been meeting at the same motel for weeks. Room 214. If you want proof, that's where you'll get it. The thought of walking into that motel made my blood boil, but I kept my head cool. This wasn't the time for impulsive moves. Let's set it up, I said, my voice cold. That evening, I waited in the parking lot of the motel, my car hidden in the shadows. Dominic sat beside me, phone in hand. "They're inside," he said, nodding toward the lit window of room 214. "Checked in about an hour ago. Haven't left." I didn't respond immediately. My eyes stayed locked on that door, my hand gripping the steering wheel so tightly I thought it might snap. Part of me wanted to kick that door in and catch them in the act, to rip the place apart right then and there. But that wasn't the plan. "Let's do this," I said finally, my voice steady. We didn't knock. Dominic crouched by the door and slid a folded piece of paper underneath it, a note I'd written earlier that day. It was simple, direct. "I know what you've been doing. Enjoy your last night together." We didn't stick around to see their reactions. Back in the car, I could see shadows moving behind the curtains as they realized what had just happened. That small glimpse of panic gave me a brief sense of satisfaction, but it didn't last long. Over the next few days, I gave Laura the space to dig her own grave. She came home late from work, always on edge, her phone practically glued to her hand. If I caught her looking at it, she'd lock the screen so fast you'd think her life depended on it. She didn't mention the note, but I could see the paranoia eating away at her. Then one evening, she came home much later than usual. I was in the living room, pretending to read the paper, when she walked in. "You're still up," she said cautiously, standing in the doorway like she wasn't sure if she should enter. "Where else would I be?" I asked without looking up. She shifted uncomfortably, clutching her purse like it was a shield. "We need to talk." I folded the paper neatly and set it on the coffee table. "Yeah," I said, finally meeting her eyes. "We do." She hesitated, then walked over and sat across from me. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Her hands fidgeted in her lap, and I could see her mind racing for the right words. "Jack," she began softly, her voice trembling, "I know things haven't been great between us lately." "That's one way to put it," I said, my voice hard as steel. "Why don't you tell me the real reason things have been off?" Her eyes widened slightly, and for a second, I saw a genuine fear flash across her face. "I don't know what you mean." I leaned forward, locking eyes with her. Room 214. "Ethan Harper. Should I keep going?" Her face went pale as the blood drained from it. She stammered, "Jack, don't." I cut her off. "Don't insult me by lying. I know everything." Tears started welling up in her eyes, but I didn't feel a shred of pity. She wasn't crying because she was sorry. She was crying because she'd been caught. "It wasn't supposed to be like this," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "No," I said, standing up. "It wasn't. But you made your choice. Now you're going to live with the consequences." That night, I called Dominic. "It's time," I said simply. "You're sure?" "Absolutely." The plan was already in motion, but saying those words out loud made it final. Laura had crossed the line, and there was no coming back. The plan was devastatingly simple, but its weight wasn't lost on me. Dominic arrived the next morning, tossing a manila folder onto my kitchen table as casually as if he were delivering a pizza. "Everything you need is in there," he said, lighting a cigarette and sitting down. I opened the folder to find Ethan Harper's life laid out in black and white. There were photos of him at work, drinking at bars, and a detailed schedule of his routine. "He's predictable," Dominic said, exhaling smoke. "Hits Marlowe's every Thursday after work. Stays late, usually until closing. No wife, no kids, no one who'll miss him too much." I stared at the pictures of Ethan, and every one of them made my blood run colder. This smug bastard had walked into my life, taken what wasn't his, and thought he could just carry on like nothing happened. "Thursday night," I said, sliding the folder back toward Dominic. "Make it happen." He nodded, his tone matter of fact. "You got it. Just make sure you're visible somewhere public. You don't want this coming back to you." I'd already arranged that part. My poker group met every Thursday, and that night would be no exception. A room full of guys would vouch for me without a second thought, and I'd have an airtight alibi. Thursday arrived, dragging on like a storm you could see coming from miles away. I went through the motions at work, but my thoughts were elsewhere, a constant churn of anticipation and anger. By the time I arrived at the poker game, my hands were jittery. "You okay, Jack?" one of the guys asked, his brow furrowed as I fumbled with my chips. "Yeah, just a long week," I said, managing a weak smile. It wasn't a lie, but it sure wasn't the full story. At midnight, my phone buzzed. Dominic's text was a single word done. I didn't reply. I didn't need to. The next morning, the news hit like a shockwave. Ethan Harper had been found dead in an alley behind Marlowe's. The report said it was a mugging gone wrong. Wallet and phone missing, a single gunshot to the chest. The police speculated it was random, the kind of thing that happens to the careless. That word stuck with me. Careless. It was the same word Dominic had used when he described Ethan's habits. And Ethan had been careless, hadn't he? Careless enough to mess with the wrong man. Laura's reaction to the news was almost satisfying to watch. She froze in the kitchen, her coffee halfway to her lips, staring at the television like it was showing her own execution. "Jack," she stammered, her voice barely audible. "Did you see this?" "Ethan, he's dead," I said flatly, not even looking at her. "Yeah, I saw." She set the cup down slowly, her hands trembling. "Do they know who did it?" "Doesn't sound like it," I replied, grabbing my coat. "Just a mugger, I guess. Happens to careless people." Her face went pale, her lips slightly parted as if she wanted to say something, but couldn't find the words. She didn't need to. The look in her eyes told me she knew. Maybe she couldn't prove it, but she knew. That should have been enough, but it wasn't. Ethan was out of the picture, but Laura wasn't off the hook. She wasn't just a participant in this. She was the one who dragged this mess into our lives. The betrayal wasn't something I could forgive, and her continued presence in my house was an insult I wasn't willing to endure. That evening, Dominic and I met at a diner to finalize the next step. He leaned across the table, lowering his voice even though the place was practically empty. "Carlos is ready. His team's in place. When they grab her, it'll look like she vanished on her own." I nodded. "Timing needs to be perfect. I don't want any mistakes." "You're covered," Dominic said confidently. "Carlos knows what he's doing. By the time anyone figures it out, she'll be a ghost." We decided Friday morning would be the moment. Carlos's team would intercept Laura on her way to work at the intersection a block from the house. A quick snatch and grab, no witnesses, no mess. From there, she'd be taken to a safe house while Dominic and I set the rest of the plan in motion. To sell the story, we'd plan a few breadcrumbs. A staged bank withdrawal, surveillance footage of someone who looked like her boarding a flight to Brazil, and a forged note explaining her decision to leave her life behind. It was airtight. "She'll disappear," Dominic said with a smirk. "Everyone will think it's guilt or fear after Ethan's death. No one's going to look your way." I stared into my coffee for a long moment, then said quietly, "Good. When this is over, I don't want to hear her name again." The rest of the night passed in silence, but I felt a grim satisfaction settle over me. It wasn't relief. Relief wasn't what I wanted. What I wanted was justice. And soon, I'd have it. Friday morning arrived, sharp and cold, the kind of day that makes you feel every inch of its bite. I was awake long before Laura, sitting at the kitchen table with a steaming cup of coffee, staring at the clock as if willing it to move faster. She came down the stairs eventually, her damp hair falling over her shoulders, and for the briefest moment, she looked like the woman I used to know, the woman I had once planned to grow old with. A pang of something, regret, maybe flickered inside me, but it was fleeting, barely a spark before it vanished. Whatever she used to be, she wasn't that person anymore. She wasn't my wife. She was a liar, a traitor, and this was the day she would pay for it. "Morning," she said casually, glancing at me as she reached for her coffee cup, her tone carrying the nonchalance of someone without a care in the world. "Morning," I replied flatly, not bothering to mask my indifference. She paused for a moment, sensing the lack of warmth in my voice, but as always, she chose to ignore it. She'd been pretending for weeks, months even, that everything between us was fine. That pretense, more than anything, sickened me. She moved toward the door, her purse slung over her shoulder, her keys jingling lightly in her hand. "See you tonight?" she asked over her shoulder, not even bothering to wait for an answer. I didn't look at her. "Sure," I said, my voice devoid of emotion. The door shut behind her, and I let out a long, slow breath. It had begun. Across the street, Carlos's team was already waiting in a black SUV, their operation precise and rehearsed. I'd seen them move before, and I knew they wouldn't leave anything to chance. As Laura's car approached the stop sign at the end of our block, the SUV pulled up behind her. Another car moved into position in front, boxing her in. It happened so fast that anyone watching would have thought it was nothing more than a traffic snag. One of Carlos's men opened her door, and before she could even scream, a needle went into her arm. She slumped forward, unconscious within seconds. Another man cut the seatbelt, hauling her limp body into the SUV's back seat while her car was quietly moved to the curb. By the time the SUV drove off, everything looked normal. No witnesses, no noise, just another routine morning in the neighborhood. I left for work an hour later, deliberately taking my time. Laura's car sat where they'd parked it, her purse conveniently absent. To anyone passing by, it would seem like she had left for work, just like every other day. Around lunchtime, I received a text from Carlos. "Package delivered." That was all he needed to say. I spent the afternoon wrapping up the next stage. Dominic had arranged for one of Carlos's associates, a woman with similar features to Laura, to make a large withdrawal from our joint account. At the bank, the forged identification and forged signature went unnoticed. Surveillance footage showed Laura clearly, smiling politely as she handed the teller a withdrawal slip for $25,000. A few hours later, the same woman appeared on airport cameras, purchasing a ticket to Rio de Janeiro. Everything was seamless, leaving a perfect trail of evidence pointing to Laura as a guilt-ridden wife fleeing her lover's messy demise. When I got home that evening, I went through the motions like any other day. I made myself a simple dinner, poured a glass of whiskey, and sat in the quiet house. Laura's phone was still on the counter, wiped clean of anything useful. It sat there like a ghost of her presence, a hollow object now devoid of meaning. The next morning, I called the police. My voice was steady as I said, "I'd like to report a missing person. My wife didn't come home last night, and I can't reach her. It's not like her to just disappear." Detective Lawrence arrived within hours. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with an air of practiced authority that made you feel like he already knew what you were going to say before you said it. I invited him in, playing the part of the concerned husband perfectly. She left for work yesterday morning. I began, gesturing toward her car, still parked on the street. "I've called her office, but they haven't heard from her either. Her phone just goes straight to voicemail." Lawrence nodded, jotting down notes in his little pad. "Anything unusual about her behavior recently?" I shook my head, forcing a worried expression. "She's been stressed, but who isn't? I thought maybe she needed some space, but now..." I let my voice catch, as though I were holding back tears. "I just want her home." The detective watched me carefully, his eyes searching for cracks in my story. "How was your marriage?" "Good." I lied smoothly, my gaze dropping to the floor. "We've had our ups and downs like anyone, but we've been trying to reconnect." He didn't seem entirely convinced, but he didn't push the issue. Instead, he left, promising to keep me updated. The story unfolded like clockwork over the next few days. The bank footage surfaced, showing Laura making the withdrawal. Airport cameras caught her boarding the flight to Rio. Even her co-workers at the agency admitted that she had seemed distant and unbalanced since Ethan's death. The narrative was perfect. A wife overwhelmed by guilt, fleeing the consequences of an affair turned tragic. Carlos kept me informed about her situation. She was being held at a secure location, far away from anyone who might recognize her. She wasn't being hurt, at least not physically, but she was being made to understand her new reality. When Detective Lawrence called me a week later, I played my role to perfection. "We're doing everything we can," he assured me, his voice carrying an odd note of sympathy. "I just want her safe," I replied, my voice cracking at all the right moments. "I don't care what happened. I just want her to come home." When I hung up, I sat back in my chair, staring out the window at the quiet street. Laura was gone. Ethan was dead. And for the first time in weeks, I felt a strange, hollow peace. There was no joy in it, no triumph. Just the cold certainty that the balance had been restored. 3 weeks had passed since Laura's disappearance, and life had fallen into a strange, quiet rhythm. The police were nowhere closer to finding her, which was exactly what I'd expected. The trail we'd left, her staged withdrawal at the bank, the surveillance footage of her boarding a flight to Rio, was foolproof. Detective Lawrence had called me several times during that period, each time with the same tired line. "We're still looking into it, Mr. Marino. These things take time." I'd respond like a grieving husband, offering hopeful words that sounded hollow even to me. Every time I hung up, I'd pour myself a drink, stare out the window, and marvel at how flawlessly it had all gone. One afternoon, Dominic showed up unannounced, his grin wide as he dropped an envelope onto my kitchen table. "You're not going to believe this," he said, sitting down and lighting a cigarette like we were catching up over a casual chat. I raised an eyebrow and opened the envelope. Inside was a printout of an email. At first, I didn't recognize the sender's name, Amanda Stokes. Then it clicked. "She's Ethan's ex," I said, my tone flat as the pieces fell into place. "Bingo," Dominic replied, exhaling smoke. Turns out she didn't take too kindly to him, trading her in for Laura. Guess she's been following them for months, waiting for her chance to blow it all up. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the page. Amanda had been the one to send me the photos, the one who'd tipped me off about Laura's affair. I thought back to that first email, the one that had set everything in motion. At the time, I'd assumed it was someone at the agency, maybe a friend who felt bad for me, or an enemy of Laura's who wanted to stir the pot. But this was something else. Amanda hadn't acted out of kindness or morality. She wasn't some noble whistleblower trying to do the right thing. She'd been playing her own game, using me to settle her score. For a moment, I wasn't sure how to feel. Should I be angry? Grateful? In the end, it didn't matter. Amanda had given me the weapon I needed, and I'd used it without hesitation. "You gonna thank her?" Dominic asked with a smirk. "No," I said, folding the email and tucking it back into the envelope. "She got what she wanted. So did I. That's enough." Dominic laughed, shaking his head. "Cold as ice, Marino. Cold as ice." I didn't respond. That weekend, I decided it was time to see Laura. Not out of pity or curiosity, I wanted closure. Carlos arranged the meeting at a warehouse on the outskirts of town, a quiet, desolate place where no one would think to look. The room was cold and dimly lit, a single chair placed under a flickering overhead light. Laura was tied to it, her hair disheveled, her face pale and gaunt. When she heard my footsteps, she looked up, her eyes dull and rimmed with red. "Jack," she whispered, her voice raw and cracked. I stood in front of her, arms crossed, taking in the sight of the woman I had once loved. She looked so small now, so broken. For a fleeting moment, I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. "You've had some time to think," I said, my voice cold and measured. "I hope it's been productive." Her lip trembled, but she didn't speak right away. When she finally did, her words came in a shaky rush. "I'm sorry, Jack. I never meant for this to happen. Please, I didn't mean to hurt you." "Stop," I snapped, cutting her off. "Don't insult me with lies, Laura. You knew exactly what you were doing. You made your choices, and now you get to live with them." Tears streamed down her face, but they didn't move me. She wasn't crying out of remorse. She was crying because she'd lost. "It wasn't supposed to be like this," she sobbed. "No, it wasn't," I said, leaning in closer. "But you threw everything away. For what? A thrill? Some idiot who's now rotting in the ground." She shook her head weakly, her sobs growing louder. "I didn't mean—" "Enough," I said firmly. "You meant every bit of it. You lied, you cheated, and you disrespected me. I would have given you everything, Laura. Everything. But you decided that wasn't enough. So now, you'll spend the rest of your life paying for it." She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. She just sat there, tears rolling down her cheeks, her shoulders shaking. Carlos stepped into the room, his expression unreadable. "You ready to wrap this up?" he asked. I nodded, taking one last look at Laura. "This is the last time you'll ever see me," I said. "I hope it was worth it." Her sobs echoed in the empty room as I walked out, the sound fading behind me with every step. That night, I sat alone in my house, staring at a glass of whiskey on the table in front of me. The house felt emptier than ever, but it wasn't the kind of emptiness that begged to be filled. It was the kind of emptiness that felt like an ending, like a clean slate. Laura was gone, Ethan was dead, and Amanda was nothing more than a name on a printout. The only thing left was me. 3 years later, Laura is nothing more than a distant memory, a ghost from a life I left behind. I sold the house, moved out of Pittsburgh, and started over. Marriage is off the table for me now. Nothing but a bad joke. Women like Laura aren't worth the trouble, and men like Ethan always get what's coming to them. I heard through the grapevine that Amanda moved on, too. She got her revenge, same as I did. Maybe that's the only kind of justice we ever really get. Revenge, dressed up as righteousness. I never thanked her, and I never will. Some things are better left unsaid. What I do know is this: trust is a fragile thing. Once it's broken, there's no fixing it. There's no going back, no repairing the damage. There's only justice. And as far as I'm concerned, justice was served. 3 weeks after Laura's disappearance, I thought the chapter was closed. Everything had gone as planned. The police were stumped, the evidence pointed to her running away, and my alibi was ironclad. But then, something I hadn't accounted for happened. A crack in what I thought was a perfect ending. It started with a knock on my door one morning. I opened it to find Detective Lawrence standing there, his face stern, holding a folder under his arm. "Morning, Mr. Marino," he said, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. "What's this about?" I asked, keeping my tone calm. Lawrence placed the folder on my kitchen table and flipped it open. Inside was a single piece of paper, a typed letter. I leaned over to read it, my pulse quickening as the words registered. "To whom it may concern, I am not missing. I left on my own, and I am safe. Please stop looking for me." It was signed Laura Marino. "That came into our precinct this morning," Lawrence said, folding his arms. "Mail from Pittsburgh, postmarked 2 days ago. Care to explain how your missing wife managed to send a letter from the city she supposedly fled?" My mind raced, trying to process the implications. The letter was fake. It had to be. Carlos had been thorough. Laura was far from Pittsburgh, locked away, somewhere no one would ever find her. "I have no idea," I said carefully, keeping my voice steady. "Could someone have forged it? It doesn't make sense." Lawrence didn't reply immediately. He just stared at me, his eyes sharp and calculating, like a predator sizing up prey. Finally, he closed the folder and picked it up. "It's interesting, isn't it? She vanishes, there's footage of her going to Rio, and now suddenly we get a letter saying she's here. Either she's playing some elaborate game, or someone else is." I shrugged, feigning frustration. "Detective, I'm just as confused as you are. If she's safe, that's all I care about." Lawrence gave me a tight smile, clearly unconvinced. "If anything else comes to light, you'll let us know, right?" "Of course," I said, walking him to the door. The moment he left, I grabbed my phone and called Dominic. "We have a problem," I said as soon as he answered. "What's going on?" I told him about the letter. There was silence on the other end before he finally said, "Carlos wouldn't slip up like that. There's no way." "Well, someone did," I snapped. "Get Carlos on the phone. Now!" A few hours later, I met Dominic and Carlos in a parking garage downtown. Carlos leaned against his car, his face calm but serious as he lit a cigarette. "I don't make mistakes," he said firmly after I explained the situation. "Your wife didn't send that letter. She's exactly where she's supposed to be. Then how the hell did it show up?" I demanded, pacing. Carlos exhaled a cloud of smoke and gestured for me to calm down. "Someone's playing games with you. If it's not her, it's someone who wants to stir the pot. Either way, it's not coming from my end. Can we confirm she's still where you left her?" Dominic asked, cutting through the tension. Carlos nodded. "I'll check in with my guys tonight. But trust me, she's not walking around sending letters." I wanted to believe him, but something about the situation didn't sit right. Carlos didn't make mistakes, but Laura had always been cunning in her own way. I didn't underestimate her ability to manipulate people, even under duress. "Check on her," I said sharply, "and let me know the second you hear anything." The The call came the next morning. Carlos's voice was calm but clipped. "We got a problem," he said. "What kind of problem?" I asked, dread pooling in my stomach. "She's gone." Those two words hit like a sledgehammer. "What do you mean gone?" "I mean she's not there," Carlos replied. "The safe house is empty. My guys found the ropes cut and no sign of her. She must have gotten help from the inside." "Jesus Christ," I muttered, gripping the phone tightly. "It gets worse," Carlos continued. "We found a message scrawled on the wall in marker. It said, 'You thought you won.'" For a moment, I couldn't speak. My carefully crafted plan was unraveling before my eyes, and now Laura was loose, somewhere out there, likely planning her next move. I spent the next 2 days waiting for the other shoe to drop. It came in the form of another letter, this time hand-delivered to my house in the middle of the night. I found it on the kitchen counter when I woke up, sitting there like a snake waiting to strike. The letter was short but cutting. "Jack, you thought you could erase me. You thought I wouldn't fight back. But you've underestimated me, like always. This isn't over. I'll be watching." There was no signature, but it didn't need one. I called Dominic immediately. "She's toying with me," I said, pacing the living room. "Relax," Dominic said, though his voice lacked its usual confidence. "She's trying to scare you. She doesn't have any power here. She escaped Carlos." I shot back. "She's smart enough to play the long game. Don't tell me she's powerless." "We'll handle it," Dominic assured me. "She doesn't have the resources to go far. We'll find her." But his words didn't soothe me. Laura had already proven she was more resourceful than I'd given her credit for. 2 weeks passed with no sign of her. No letters, no messages, no sightings. Just silence. I started to let my guard down, thinking maybe she had gone underground for good. But then came the call from Detective Lawrence. "We've got new evidence in your wife's case," he said, his tone sharper than usual. "What kind of evidence?" I asked, keeping my voice neutral. "Footage," he replied, "of her leaving the safe house. And guess what? She wasn't alone. Looks like she's got someone on her side." I froze. The thought of Laura aligning herself with someone else, someone capable, was a twist I hadn't anticipated. "I'd like you to come down to the station to answer a few questions," Lawrence continued, his tone leaving no room for argument. I hung up, my mind racing. Laura wasn't just trying to disappear. She was turning the game around. And now it was clear. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot.